Welcome to the Vocation of the Business Leader podcast. I'm Greg Bostard. Here we explore how Catholic leaders let Christ and the teachings of the church he founded guide their work, integrating faith and business. Each episode offers inspiring stories to help you live an undivided life. Thanks for joining us. Let's meet our guest, Deacon Charlie Echererry. Is that right?
That's right. Nailed it. Good job, Greg. Nice work.
Yeah. So welcome, Deacon. Could you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, well, it's great to be on. Thank you. I especially love new shows. I'm a big fan of podcasts, and so if I can be a part of, cementing a future success, I'm always down for the journey. So I'm Deacon Charlie Echererry. I'm ordained for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, which is where I am right now. I've been ordained for 7 years now. And I was originally born here in LA, but I left when I was very young. My dad ran the Latin American and Caribbean division of a bank. And so I grew up in a number of different places throughout the world. First in Mexico City, then in Buenos Aires, Argentina, then in Venezuela, then in the Caribbean, ultimately landed back in South Florida, which right now is bracing for a really big storm. Landed back in South Florida, and I did high school, college there, and then came back to the land of my birth many years later as an adult. Kind of did a full circle there, and I was born into a faithful Catholic family. I'd qualify it not to diminish their faith because they had strong faith, but also a very culturally Catholic experience. And maybe some of that, not entirely my parents' fault, more about them being recent immigrants to the U.S. and, having to focus on a lot of different things. And then having this experience of growing up in other countries where, perhaps the faith is very well known, but it can sort of seep into the background. And sometimes it's hard to see because it's just like wallpaper in a way. And so my experience coming up, even though I was born into a Catholic family and, raised with the sacraments and, that whole thing. Nevertheless, I was very much cultural Catholic, grew up a cultural Catholic, fairly significantly so. And then during my kind of college experience, like a lot of folks do, sadly, I faded from my faith until, ultimately I met the woman who would become my wife, who has her own story, which is a really interesting one, which we can get into to the extent that it's relevant here. But her conversion to a life of faith and discipleship really helped to bring about my reversion to the same. And then, throughout, I guess the other facet I would mention, just at a high level, is professionally, I've been in the media industry and the entertainment industry pretty much my entire career. So very focused on story and helping, create new things and look at new, entrepreneurial opportunities across a wide assortment of fronts. And so I've got 5 kids. I'm into all kinds of different things, which we can get into, but that's a little bit of a snapshot.
Thank you. So before we hit record, we were talking about the Lila Rose interview, which I highly recommend that viewers go listen to. So tell us about how you met your wife.
Yeah, so my first job after college, I got a degree in communications, which was, meant you were supposed to end up in the entertainment industry or doing media or advertising or something. So predictably, I did none of those things. I ended up going into sales, and specifically office equipment sales, which is like the least interesting, kind of profession you can ever think of getting into. My wife was the office manager, kind of like not even office manager, almost like the receptionist in a way. At least when I first met her, she ended up becoming more of the office manager later on as we dated. But she was basically the receptionist at this job at this client that I called on. And so we met that way. Some interesting circumstances around our meeting is just the fact that I was called there to that business by a technician, a service repair person who had gone to fix this copier that they had that was broken, and he couldn't fix it. He's like, "You're going to need to buy a new one. You better call the salesperson." The reason it's interesting is because that was supposed to happen, but it literally never happened. The service techs never gave leads we're always, in fact, complaining about how they never did that because they seem to be in a prime position to provide a lead, and they never did. But in this particular case, this technician did. And that's what led to she and I actually meeting.
That's awesome. You've had a long, successful career in working in large corporations. And then in 2018, you started Black Brown Consulting. Tell us about that journey, and what was it that made you come up with the Black Brown concept?
Yeah. So, after a stint, as I mentioned, in the sort of office equipment realm, I quickly realized that if I was serious about this entertainment business thing that I had studied and wanted to do, that I needed to get out of South Florida, which is where I had graduated. And so I left South Florida and then came to Los Angeles to start my entertainment or media career, and that's what actually happened. And I was very fortunate to work at some big media companies. AOL is an example. America Online was known at the time it was known as, which had this crazy idea of inventing the internet, essentially making the internet as ubiquitous as the telephone was actually their mission statement, and you could say they largely succeeded in doing that, mostly through sending CD-ROMs in every direction on the planet. So I worked there. I worked at the Walt Disney Company, which was an incredible experience. Taught me about content, storytelling, brand management, just a lot of different things. And then I was recruited from the Walt Disney Company to run Univision's digital business. Univision is a big Spanish language media company, which most folks have heard of, even if they're not Hispanic themselves. And so I did that for about 6 years. Learned a lot about running a scale organization, leading throughout the enterprise, leading leaders, which is not something I'd done before. I had led frontline people, but never led leaders, which is a completely different thing. And so learned quite a bit there. And then I left the corporate world. I just, kind of burned out on it, frankly, when it got into the whole political realm of things. The way I looked at it, it's like, your first part of your career, you're very equipped at the tactics, right? You know how to do something, you know how to get something to happen. Then you evolve into sort of the strategic realm, right? You know how to see something that yet isn't and assemble the pieces to get it to happen, because there's an opportunity that you can see, a white space that you can see. And that seemed like pretty cool. And then there's this level beyond the strategy, which doesn't happen, thankfully, everywhere as much as in other places. But it happened that in Univision, it was a very political organization. And it introduced me to that sort of next realm, which is the political realm, which in some ways stops being about the business. And that's what makes it so corrosive, and starts being about, well, how is this going to benefit me positively or negatively? And so you're not really making decisions necessarily about the health of the business, or even in some cases, the health of the people that you're leading, but really more about optics and positioning and advantage. And when I started realizing that, and that I was being at first unwittingly and then eventually a witting participant in it, I was like, I don't want to be in this anymore. So I got out of the corporate world and I got hooked up with the startup scene here in LA. Helped to fund and raise capital for and build a couple of digi-tech brands and companies. So that was really fun, very frothy time, in LA, 2012, 13, 14. Snapchat was brand new. A lot of these platforms were just starting, and we were, there was always that sort of sense of new things. And I had obviously been there for phase 1 of the internet. This was phase 3 maybe of the internet, the kind of the mobile and social phase of it. And so it was exciting to be a part of that and build, companies and all of that. Taught me a lot about being an entrepreneur, frankly, which I know you've been for a long time, but I had not been. And so it taught me, those skills, and I use them to this day. And then in 2018, I kind of left the startup world and put out my own shingle. And the company is called Black Brown. It is named Black Brown. It's a bit of a musical homage to Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington has an orchestral suite called Black, Brown, and Beige. And it's a musical kind of rendition telling the story of, people emigrating into this country and kind of, changing the tapestry of the American experience. That matches a lot with the work that we do, because Black Brown is an advisory. So we're basically management consulting, but our focus is on constituencies that are emerging. So think of like the Latino community or urban communities, that are very, very important in terms of setting the tone for the culture, but oftentimes not thought about immediately. So that's sort of the work that we do. And we're a little bit of a snapshot of the career.
So Black Brown has been around about 6 years. So what changes have you seen through those years, and what challenges and opportunities do you see for the future?
Well, I mean, I think one of the changes we saw is a change that everybody saw, which was COVID, right?
Mm-hmm.
Massive change in how business is done, what is valued versus what isn't, cultures evolving and changing, all of that. And then you also had, sort of related to the COVID experience, a lot of what happened around the summer of 2020 with the death of George Floyd and a lot of unrest and those different things, which definitely touched on a lot of the work that, at least tangentially, that we're involved in. Although, obviously, from a Catholic vantage point, there's a very different perspective that I had on some of those issues. So those are like, big changes that were happening in the country socially. In our own business, one of the bigger changes that we've enacted in that time is not just leading on developing strategies, but also in helping our clients implement those strategies, right? How do you like, make these things real, I would say, in your company. And then lastly, from a spiritual vantage point, the idea of a deeper and pretty consistent integration of faith into, every aspect of this business, every decision being guided in part by that, even though our clients are not like, religious necessarily. Right. Frankly, a number of the team is not. Even my business partner isn't really. He's not even Christian. So, so it's been a really interesting experience in that regard. But seeing how that Catholic identity has flourished despite those things, and how there's been a lot of interesting ministerial opportunities and evangelical opportunities that have been presented as a result of that.
So, throughout your career, what was your faith journey during that time, and how did you deal with the corporate world?
Well, I was the good news for dealing with the corporate world is it was a lot easier for me because I was very nominally Catholic for a long time. So, as I mentioned, I had this cultural kind of Catholicism experience. My wife's conversion eventually led to my reversion, but that didn't happen until 15 or so years ago. So I'd already been, working in a corporate setting for a while. Early part of my experience was I was just like everybody else. Faith didn't really show up in that way, certainly not publicly. And, I wore a lot of masks just like everybody else does in corporate world, right? You kind of put on a lot of masks. There's things that you're not allowed to say or do, or you think you can't or whatever. I would say maybe when that started to change for me was in the most significant way when I worked at Univision. This was my last corporate job, which I left there at this point 10 years ago now. And where I had this moment of really bringing my faith into that environment, super secular. I mean, like there's regular secular and then there's uber secular. Okay. This is like uber secular. Okay. Setting. But I remember it specifically because I was super stressed out. I had really bad insomnia, under tremendous stress. And that's what happens in a lot of these you get these positions. I was an executive vice president. I was leading hundreds of people, responsible for hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue. It's like one of these crazy jobs that people, that are very high pressure. And anyway, I got this super nasty bout of insomnia, like you read about, like you hear about, right? I mean, just monster insomnia where like there'd be days I wouldn't sleep. Like I'm not talking about, I slept 2 hours. I mean, I haven't slept in 3 days. That's the kind of insomnia. And insomnia is really weird because it's so lonely. It's like the loneliest thing. You're perfectly fine. Everything's okay. You're not having a heart attack. You're not dying. None of that. But everybody's asleep and peaceful. And you have to tiptoe and walk around because God forbid you wake them and they get to join you in the hell you're in. Right. So it's this really strange kind of dynamic where you feel very isolated and very alone. And then it starts getting to you, in addition to what sleep deprivation does, which physically gets to you, right? You just can't think as straight. You got trouble concentrating. You're irritable and cranky. It can be really crippling. I have a really soft spot in my heart for anyone going through insomnia. But the good news, if you are, and if you're listening, it will change and it will go away. And that's what happened in my case because I finally surrendered. Now, the reason I give you this background is because the moment it showed up, right, in my work in that corporate setting for the first time was a colleague of mine who I was on the phone with. And I was just saying, you know what, I'm in a really tough situation. This is actually somebody who reported to me, by the way. I'm in a really tough situation and I haven't slept and it's just freaking me out. And like, I didn't know much about him personally. He asked me what was wrong because he could tell, like, you know, and so I shared with him. And at that moment he says, he actually said first, he said, I'm a Christian and I believe in the power of intercessory prayer. Would you mind if I prayed for you? That's what he said to me. His boss on a phone call, right? As like he's in an airport somewhere and I'm like walking the hallways of this cold, secular corporate world. And I said, yeah, I would like that. And he did. And he prayed over me on the phone, prayed over me. And I'm sitting here, you know, in this like marble conference room thing as somebody's praying over me on the phone. And his courage really struck me. You know, the fact that he would take that kind of chance, not knowing anything about my faith experience, right? I could have been like some rabid atheist who would have fired him or something. You know, you have no idea. So, but he took that chance and it really struck me. And of course, the prayer was helpful. So that's when it was like, you know, it really hit me. It's like, oh man, you know, I'm not doing this right. I'm not doing this right. And I very soon thereafter left the corporate world, got into this sort of more entrepreneurial phase of my life. And I made the decision at that point to really start living a more integrated life. And I say I made the decision, not really. I mean, God really provided the grace in order to make that determination. And it hasn't been perfect, but I think increasingly there's been a deepening, you know, day over day, you know, hour after hour, a deepening and a drawing closer into that integration and trying to be the same Catholic everywhere. And, you know, sometimes you do it with humor. Sometimes you do it not so with humor. You know, when people say the Lord's name, like they'll say Jesus Christ, and I say is Lord, you know, I complete the sentence and it's a joke. And they're like, what? You know, they're cursing basically. And then you say is Lord. They don't even get it. They don't even understand it. I learned that from a Protestant colleague of mine as well. And I thought it was great. I was like, that's great. It's awesome. So little things like that, you know, have helped me to kind of deepen that sort of walk of integration. But it's a challenge to put the mask down.
Yeah. So obviously you're a deacon. How long do you feel like that you were being called before you responded?
Since day zero, like since the very first
Baptism.
moment. Yeah, since baptism. That's definitely when that call began.
Yeah.
And I just didn't hear it for a very long time. Yeah, I mean, that's how God calls, right? I mean, it's not, I mean, for some people have Damascus, you know, sort of experiences. My wife had one. If you mentioned the Lila Rose show, she goes into that and tells a little bit about that story, but where she had a real mystical encounter, literally met Jesus. Well, I mean, we have too, as well, in a variety of other ways, in other people, in the Eucharist, in 1,000 different ways. But, you know, some of us don't have that real anthropological experience of having met the guy named Jesus. She did. But my experience was, you know, hearing this call over the course of years, becoming more clear and more visible. It's like, you know, it's been described as like the candlelight in the dark room, right? It's like if you've got a candle lit in a room and it's lit like the ones we're in, and then suddenly you turn off the light, that little bit of light, at first everything just seems pitch black, but then 15 minutes later, you're like, oh, I can see everything, right? Even though it's a little tiny bit of candlelight. That's kind of how discernment is and vocation is, at least in my case. It was like a series of really synchronous coincidences and things that, like, after a while, you're like, oh, you're trying to tell me something. Oh, I get it. It's just we're really thick. You know what I mean? At least I am. So from day one, and I think a moment of inflection in that calling, however, was me actually interacting for the first time with a deacon, or my first active memory of interacting with a deacon at a liturgy, and like recognizing him for who he was. And I'm sure I'd seen others in my life at Mass, but I never distinguished, paid attention. It's amazing the level of blindness, that we go at least I went through a lot of my life spiritually, blindness. And that, God is so merciful and he just lets you stumble through all this stuff. But meeting and seeing a deacon in action and kind of that really intellectually started to make some things turn for me. And I wanted to find out more about, like, what is that? Who is that? And, why is he kissing that lady after Mass? And I thought these guys are supposed to be single, celibate. What's going on? So, that was a major moment of inflection for me. And then the more that I encountered intellectually the knowledge of the diaconate, the more my heart opened up to the fact that this is what God actually wanted me to be from the very beginning.
So at what point, you said your wife started her, it was like 15 years ago, her journey. So were you at Univision when
I was. I had just gotten there, as a matter of fact, when she, that was sort of our Vietnam, right? She's like, I'm going crazy and having PTSD and insomnia and freaking out. And she's like, having mystical encounters with Jesus and rocking everyone's world in every direction, including mine, because she really put to shame what little faith I had, right? This is a really weird time, but sometimes God, like, nudges you out of your slumber. And if you've ever done that with a person, they can wake up gently or they can spook. You know what I mean?
Right.
And for me, it was like spooking. But yeah, it was around that the same time.
Now, you said something so your brother is a priest, correct?
Correct. Yeah. He's a Benedictine monk, but also a priest.
Was her conversion somehow tied to your brother? Or was that just something else?
In talking in this show with Lila, she asked a similar question that I hadn't considered before, which was the relationship between the conversion, reversion, my brother's priesthood, my parents, like all these things. But there was definitely it's almost like you can imagine God's grace is like a stone that hits a placid lake, and there's like this ripple effect that happens. And, the ripples go on, and I'm still feeling them, right? But there's a moment of impact of the ripple, right? And I think that moment was one of those moments of impact, because when she asked me, I thought about it too. My wife and I actually left the studio and we continued the conversation. There definitely was other things happening supernaturally at that time. And I think a lot of it may have had to do with my brother's discernment, first of a monastic, vocation, a call to be a monk, to be, to be a religious, and then ultimately his call to the priesthood, because those things, first of all, he and I were very connected. There's only two siblings. We're less than 2 years apart, very close, grew up very close together. So we're very connected. And then, my wife is going through this reversion experience, and she gets these sort of prophetic words as she's going through it about my brother. And so like all these things are very, connected. I'm not sure I'll see exactly how clearly until we get to the other side, but there's definitely a lot related in that. In fact, my brother and I were ordained 2 weeks apart, right? No planning, no coordination, no like, hey, why don't you go be an observer at this weird Benedictine abbey while I go to this information day about the diaconate exactly 2 years later. And so it lines up exactly. So we're ordained 10 days apart. Like, I mean, it's insanity, right? How that happened. The fact that I preached at his Mass of Thanksgiving, that I served, one of the only Masses I had yet served as a deacon was his Mass of ordination. I mean, it's like, what, So, God's crazy like that.
Yeah. You can't make that stuff up.
Nope, you cannot.
So since being a deacon, how do you feel the difference between how God is working in your life and your relationships?
Well, I think it's like, I get asked a lot about the diaconate, and specifically some of the questions are like, what do you do as a deacon, right? And how long does becoming a deacon take? And how many hours do you dedicate to your diaconal ministries and things like that? And they're great questions and they're very innocent, but it also in the questions is a really significant misapprehension. And so oftentimes, and I don't do this to be snarky, I do it very gently, but sometimes I'll ask on the way back, I'll ask a question as the answer. If the person is married, for instance, I would say something like, how many hours do you spend on being a husband? Right? How long did it take you to get ready to be a father? Right? Because that's the thing about the diaconate. The diaconate is who you are. It's your isness, right? So in a way, how much does it take? It takes 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, because that's how long I am who I am, right? So it's always on. Same thing with being a dad, same thing with being a husband, right? So it's a vocation. And what's changed for me in the diaconate is a deeper and fuller appreciation of who I am, because I didn't even know me like I know me now, right? So, which is weird to say because it's like a discovery thing, but you can say it as a married person, right? When we first get married, yes, you're learning about your spouse, obviously. Like, she likes to eat this and this is how she brushes her teeth and blah, blah, blah. Great. But you also learn more about you, right? These are the things that I really love, that I enjoy, that I don't like. I mean, you learn more about yourself. So you could see it in that case. Diaconate's the same thing. You learn about yourself as you learn about your partner, which in that context is Jesus, right? So it's a deepening, is what I would say, of an understanding of who you are, like, personally.
So, see, I heard about, I really like your Living the Call podcast.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah. So what do you think the key is to a successful podcast?
Oh, wow. Well, I think there's a couple things that I think about that are important with anything that reaches out to people. And that is that you have a real clear understanding of what it is you're trying to do. Like, who are you trying to talk to? Starting with the audience is something people oftentimes don't do. They might start with, hey, I like this other show and I want to make something similar. Or maybe I've had a career in this and I want to talk about it. Which, by the way, doesn't mean it's not going to work. Those things can work too. But if you start with the audience, what is it that, who's the audience that you're trying to reach, and what do you think would work with them? I think that that's a good first step. And then really crystallizing the value proposition of the show. Like you've done it with your show, right? It's like, this is a show for people who are business leaders who want to hear about other business leaders and kind of see how they're living their life at work, kind of thing. That's great. That's exactly right. So like, it's what you're doing is you're building up a listener promise that is reliable every time, right? Because that's what people do, whether we know it or not. When you engage with a piece of content, whether it's visual or audio, it's because there's a promise that's been made and you're seeing if the promise is fulfilled by virtue of seeing it, right? A horror movie is supposed to be scary, right? A rom-com is supposed to be equal parts funny and romantic. There's a promise that's been made. A podcast is similar, right? The promise that you've made is this listener promise. And the idea is like hitting that as reliably as you can every time you do it, whether it's daily, weekly, monthly, however you do your show. So that's another part, is like asking yourself, what is my listener promise? Like, what am I really, trying to do? In the case of my show from the very beginning, what I thought was I want to have conversations with people who are living out their Christian vocations in positions of cultural influence. Where that intersection happens, right? I'm living out my vocation, but I'm doing it in a way that influences culture, whether that's an artist, a singer, a bishop, a sculptor, a scientist, whatever. But like, that was the promise that I made initially. And because of that, it impacted the kind of show that I would make, which was, I wanted it to be very conversational. I wanted it to be a show where people would discover an interesting voice and say like, oh, I want to find out more about them, right? Because that's the other thing that is about podcasts is a lot of people listen to podcasts, they'll go and do the research. You don't have to tell them everything. You don't have to deliver everything in the context of the show. Consumers are smart, connected, and they're inquisitive. And so if they hear an interesting voice, they're going to be like, who is that guy, Greg? I want to find out more about him. And they're going to go and you look it up. In fact, this has happened consistently with my doing of my show, that I'll have people tell me, oh, I listened to that episode, and they'll tell me something about the guest that I had no idea about because they've gone and studied it.
Right.
You know what I mean? They've been like, oh, such and such. Did you know that he did this other movie? And I was like, no, we didn't talk about that.
What would you tell a younger Catholic businessman that feels called to the diaconate, but is afraid to take that step because he feels like he's already stretched too far or some other fear?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question, Greg. And I'm super thankful that you asked it. Look, I have a lot of thoughts on this. I'm going to try not to ramble too long, Greg. You're going to cut me off. Okay. But so look, God calls you, like I mentioned in my own story, God is calling. It's not that he's stopped calling men to the diaconate or the priesthood, frankly. It's that, our lives are full of distraction and they're full of interference, and the signal doesn't get through because we're not kind of paying attention or listening as well as we should. But God is definitely calling. And when I go out and I either give talks or whatever forum I'm in, I definitely have a lot of guys, younger guys, guys in their early 30s, even sometimes in their late 20s, they'll come to me and it's like, I think I feel the Lord is calling me to, to a life of the clergy, to a life of, I don't know what it is. It's not the priesthood. A lot of guys will tell me it's not the priesthood because they discerned out of the priesthood as an example, or they're already married, right? So they'll say, but I just feel called to the altar. I feel called to preach. I feel called to, to service, to God's people, to the vulnerable, to the poor. And so when young guys approach me that way, I encourage them, right? So first of all, to stay obviously close to God in prayer, but secondarily to actually scratch that itch. And see, a lot of guys in the diaconate, they won't do that. And why won't they do that, Greg? Because we've implemented the diaconate very poorly in this country. And what I mean by that is, and this sometimes gets me in trouble, but what I mean by that is that the diaconate in the United States is a unique older retired guy phenomenon. Okay. And I don't know where that came from, because it has nothing to do with the church's mind on what the permanent diaconate be. Maturity, yes, which is why the church says universally that a man ordained to the permanent diaconate should be no younger than 35. That part's clear. You're not going to have 18-year-old permanent deacons. Got it. Okay. But beyond that, from 35 to about 65, which is about the average age of most deacons in the U.S., I don't know what's going on, okay? Besides maybe some of these younger guys going into a program and being turned away. And I do think, anecdotally at least, that is happening. That guys will come in and say, I think I'm interested in this. Let me go to an information day. And somebody will say, you got young kids? Wait till they're out of college and you're retired and then come do that. But I mean, and that's not to say God doesn't call people older. Of course he does. Look at the scriptures. The Old Testament in particular is full of like 80-year-old people getting called for the first time at 80. Totally get it. Okay. However, we have to trust the wisdom of the church, and the wisdom of the church says that the permanent diaconate begins no earlier than 35. That means that a 5-year program, you could start the diaconate at age 30 for formation, but nobody does. And I don't know why that is. So I encourage younger people to pray this through, to scratch the itch. And then I also am mindful, to tell them that, the church confirms the sacraments, every sacrament, including orders. So if the church says, good, right, wrong, or indifferent, if the church says, no, you're not, then you have to listen to that, right? But so many guys don't even try because they're like, I don't think, I've even heard young guys tell me, I'm not old enough, right? Or they'll ask me, I'm not old enough, right, to be a deacon. I'm like, old enough? What are you talking about? They're like way old to be a deacon. So yeah, there's a lot there, but I really love to encourage younger guys. I think younger guys who have young families, who are on an ascendant track in their careers, who are their influential capital, their influence capital, if it was an asset class, is very high at that point. They're making things happen in the world. Why wouldn't you want those people to also be like living this amazing, clerical life and be a bridge, right, into the church? I mean, are you kidding me? It's like a huge opportunity. And again, that's not to say everybody is called who is young, because you might not be, right? But we've done something wrong, because less than 4%, Greg, of the deacons in the U.S., less than 4 are under 50. How does that happen? Your theory is as good as mine.
So when did you start being bold in your faith?
When did I start being bold in my faith? I mean, I feel like St. Augustine on this one. Just, late have I done it. Late have I done it. I don't know, super late, probably. I mean, the question is not, for me, when have I done it? I probably did something early, but the question is consistency. Like consistently, reliably, right? That idea of somebody saying, Jesus Christ as a curse, and me saying is Lord, me doing that consistently, that didn't happen until like, just a little while ago, right? But I may have said that one time and then not said it the next 100 times, So, yeah, but I mean, I think that my journey really began in terms of its boldness probably in my maybe early 30s, I would say, maybe early to mid 30s, that it really began to like, no, I believe this and it's okay. And if you disagree, we're going to talk about it and we'll wrestle it to the ground. Before that, it was like, oh, you disagree, I disagree. Who cares? Not important enough for us to argue about it. So I was, as I mentioned on Lila's show, I was a very tepid, just weak as water, as the Brits say, Catholic. Yeah. So not a good answer there, Greg.
So what advice would you have for Catholic professionals that are living a divided life?
Well, I mean, just to recognize, if you recognize that you're living a divided life, you should give like high praise and glory to God, because that's the first step. There's many guys who don't even know it's happening. Okay.
Right.
So give thanks to God if you realize that you're living a divided life, because that is a grace which you can now build on. Having said that, it takes intention and it takes real effort to do it. It is much easier to live a compartmentalized life. You're going to have a lot less conversation. Sometimes guys, especially Greg, we don't like to talk too much. So it's like it lets you skip over an entire conversation. Okay, I'm going to take that. It's an easy one. So it takes intentionality and it takes effort. But it is about, making the decision to put the masks down. That's what it's about. And the mask is, I walk into the big, conference room like the ones I had in my corporate career at Disney or at Univision or wherever it was. And, this is so big and it's so like professional and everybody's dressed up in a suit and like, oh my gosh, it's crazy to preach Jesus in that environment. It's insane to do it, right? Because we're so like, in awe of like these, even if we're not objective or like consciously in awe, we sort of are in a way, right? It's like, this is not an environment fit for this. And I'm not saying whip out your rosary in the conference room at Disney, but you have to be able to put the mask down, right? And let people know that your barometer and the center of your decision-making is your faith, that is a centerpiece, and come what may. So it takes courage too. And the good thing is God is really merciful and he's very gentle. So he doesn't make demands that you can't fulfill. So he's going to dole out the grace, and he's going to build your courage, incrementally, and you'll find it easier to do the courageous thing the next time if you do it the first time, right? So it is that, it is putting the mask down and just saying, I am going to be this person everywhere that I go. And if you don't know who you are, that's also, if you say, I don't really know who I am, that is also a great grace. And I think that means you need more time in spiritual direction, or just a spiritual director. Maybe you don't have one. You need more time in front of the Eucharist. You need more time helping the poor and the vulnerable, because that's where Jesus is. You need more time doing that. But you'll find out who you are the more you do of that stuff. Like surefire recipe, guaranteed. You'll know more about who you are. And then you can take that next step about, look, okay, now that I know who I am, I'm going to be this person no matter what's going on, no matter the environment, no matter the surroundings. And I'm going to remember that I'm always in front of another child of God, which, by the way, is the other side of this that people forget, Greg, is that it's not just about you. It's not just about you, right? So like, right. How do I live my faith at work? Yeah, okay, let's do that. Yes, you should. Let's get better at that. Awesome. That customer, that client, that partner, that person who doesn't know, like in my case, in the entertainment industry, is like opposed to Jesus, hates the church. That is God's kid. And honoring and reverencing that person as well, in whatever way is appropriate for that circumstance, okay, is also something we have to remember to do. And that ultimately is very attractive anyway. So it's just good marketing. Okay. You want to make more Christians? That's a good way to do it.
Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you'd like to talk about?
Great questions, by the way. Have you ever heard of the Lex Friedman podcast?
Oh, yeah. I like him.
I could tell. It's like, it's got a Lex Friedman kind of vibe, which I like. Hey, that's a good start if you're making a podcast, my friend. He's got a lot of followers. Yeah, look, I mean, one of the things that the only thing I would mention as it relates to kind of business things is something that I've come across only recently in a more organized way. And that is the idea of consecrating your business to Christ or to his Blessed Mother. Just consecrate the business, give it to him, literally, like formally, liturgically, if you can, invite your pastor to come over to your headquarters and have him literally consecrate it to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, right? Yeah. Zero downside. So that's my parting word.
Awesome. That's a good way to end. All right. Thank you for joining us today's episode of the Vocational Business Leader Podcast. We hope you found inspiration as we explore the powerful union of faith and business. If you enjoyed the episode, please share, subscribe, and leave a review. Your support helps us. Until next time, may God bless you. Bye.